After visiting the Nahant Oceanological Society, you can begin a small investigation of your own, one that ultimately uncovers facts of collusion between corporations and the authorities, and reveals who was poisoning the waters of the Commonwealth. The society itself is represented by two small buildings, a laboratory and an administrative office of the organization. Before the war, the primary tasks of the oceanologists were observing and protecting marine life from various external factors. From the terminal records found inside, only limited information is available. An article titled Goals explains that society was a kind of environmentalist organization, which attempted to raise public awareness of water pollution issues, and also researched the effects of radiation on oceanic creatures, while blaming General Atomics and Poseidon Energy for excessive environmental pollution. There are several interesting entries that indicate a real and ongoing problem at the time. Monitoring of crustaceans showed that the average mass of crabs increased by 14% and lobsters by 12%. This is not particularly good news, since larger crustaceans require more food to maintain their body mass, which could very well lead to a sharp depletion of food sources, and eventually to the collapse of the local colony. In other words, a sudden increase in size would lead to an equally sudden shortage of food and population extinction. The scientists attempted to contact journalists from Galaxy News, but those twisted their findings, claiming instead that the upcoming shellfish fishing season would be excellent. Water observations conducted during the same period showed that over the course of 14 consecutive months, the toxicity of cod and barnacles increased by an average of 34% each month, compared to fish and crabs kept in a control tank. The scientists attempted to contact the Boston Port Authority, but their calls were completely ignored. The total increase in radioactive particles amounted to approximately 500% over those 14 months. One of the observers at Lake Wanapoid collected water samples prior to a fishing tournament with the intention to conduct an independent analysis and compared the results with his own findings. Radiation and pollution levels were found to be 15 times higher than in the water sample from the previous year, exceeding all acceptable limits and making the water completely unsuitable for any form of life. The findings were forwarded to the official responsible for monitoring the lake for final verification. Dr. Casey Reed reported that society would be shutting down during the last week of October. Some members would attend a symposium on ocean life protection in Monterey, California. At the same time, she would be preparing for a harbor blockade and coordinating volunteers, stating that she would be working outside the office during that period. She ended the message with a request to Jim, asking him to shut down the robots before leaving for the weekend. At present, we only know that at the exact time the bombs fell, the society was already closed, which explains the absence of skeletons inside. Jim, however, never shut down the robots, leaving them to repeat long outdated facts about the ocean for 200 years. Additionally, a holotape from a creative studio DLC called Cyberdog appears, telling the story of one of Nahant's employees, Charisma Shankar. However, it's not particularly connected to today's investigation, and aside from Cyberdog, just adds a bit of life to Nahant. So what do we have at this point? For unknown reasons, crustaceans in the ocean were rapidly increasing in size, displacing other aquatic life. The Boston Port Authority, as well as Galaxy News, remained silent and misled the public. At the same time, Lake Wanapoid experienced a 500% increase in toxicity in just slightly over a year. Logically, the next step would be to visit the lake and search for additional information there. However, before doing so, it's worth visiting another place, Lake Cochituate. In the Vault Dweller's Survival Guide, a mass fusion waste disposal site is introduced, consisting of two ponds filled with large quantities of toxic and radioactive barrels. There's also an even greater amount of waste stored in destroyed trucks nearby, which never made it into the water. The barrels appear to have been damaged by prolonged exposure to water, and periodically went contaminants, rapidly polluting both the water and surrounding soil. The water and ground around them are already so saturated with radiation and chemicals that they literally glow. At present, the area around the lake is inhabited by various vermin, raiders, and a super mutant camp. Judging by the remaining structures, a small number of people lived here before the war, and were inevitably exposed to chemicals and radiation from the lake. According to the guide, the waste disposal site belonged to Mass Fusion, a claim I personally doubt. Now we move on to the Lake Wanapoid. Wandering around the shoreline, you will find a small shed containing a monitoring station terminal. According to the data, nearly all indicators of water pollution are at maximum levels: toxicity, radioactivity, heavy metal concentration, fecal matter, and other contaminants exceeded extreme thresholds, while dissolved oxygen levels remained moderate, making the water dangerous to living organisms. From the same terminal, it can be clear that the most likely cause of contamination was illegal waste dumping. The scientists looking after the lake began to suspect General Atomics' Garvega and Saugus iron works. About a month after the first entry, on June 25, 2077, the monitoring station staff filed an official request to close the lake due to the continuously rising pollution levels. They also recommended that the mayor cancel the planned fishing tournament. The event itself was sponsored by General Atomics and supported by the mayor of Boston, who promised large cash prizes to the winners and encouraged families to attend it, watching the tournament from observation decks or in the nearby General Atomics gallery. Notes about the tournament can be found in several places around the lake. Not a single fish was caught. 27 people who came into contact with the water developed severe illnesses. One boat sank, and 2 survivors later required treatment for serious radiation burns. Several people appeared to have died. One of the notes found near the lake states that 2 weeks later, on July 16th, approximately 16 families affected by the incident filed a lawsuit, most likely against the city administration. The chief city attorney stated in one of the notes that all materials related to the incident would be preserved, despite considering the legal basis for the lawsuit to be unjustified. While expressing condolences to the victims, a handwritten note by Richard Thorndike was later added, requesting the erasure of the monitoring station records. Near the same lake is a mass fusion waste storage facility, which, as you have probably already guessed, turns out to be the main culprit of today's investigation. After the war, elevated radiation levels remain inside due to residual radioactive waste, along with several feral ghouls. The supervisor's terminal contains information that allows us to complete the investigation. But first, it's worth noting that in the same survival guide, mass fusion is described as a leader in the safe storage and disposal of radioactive waste. In the first entry, recorded about a week after the fishing tournament, it stated that a man named Lester was run over by a forklift while it was reversing, resetting facility's record of 34 days without incidents. Management ordered the supervisor to hang posters, reminding workers to wear protective hats. In the second entry, the company planned a retreat for all personnel in 2 weeks. Mr. Feld informed the supervisor that his presence was mandatory, as with all employees. The manager complained that he was already tired of dealing with the staff, and now had to pretend to like his co-workers for an entire week, remarking that sometimes he envied Lester. In the final entry, dated 8/22, recorded shortly after the vacation ended, an unannounced visit by a hazardous material inspector is mentioned. The inspector arrived without prior notice to audit the company's operations. The supervisor grew nervous that the inspector might start suspecting something. During a conversation with Mr. Feld, he was instructed that if their activities were exposed, the inspector should be disposed of. Mr. Feld clearly had no intention of merely asking the inspector to leave. Ultimately, company's deception was uncovered. Mass fusion had broken through part of the foundation to access a pipe beneath the building, into which they had been dumping waste. The inspector was most likely thrown into the pipe, and at the current time is a ghoul, though not a glowing one. The supervisor's only concern, however, was the possibility of receiving a life sentence. At this point, all available information has been gathered, and conclusions can be drawn. At a certain point, the Nahant Oceanological Society noticed unusual crustaceans growth and increasing water toxicity. Soon after, an employee monitoring Lake Wanapoid detected rising pollution levels, which was followed by the tragic fishing tournament incident. The Nahant scientists never fully suspected mass fusion, while the company actively dumped massive amounts of waste into the lake, leading to civilian deaths. Mass fusion, as it became clear, dumped waste not only into Lake Wanapoid, but also into Lake Cochituate, and did so at such an intense rate that the water in the waste ponds began to glow, while radiation levels in the center of Wanapoid could reach 120 rads per second. As you can understand, both lakes are natural water reservoirs, with ordinary soil beds, lacking any protective lining at the bottom. This allows lake water to seep into the groundwater and connect with the nearby rivers, ponds, and other lakes. Therefore, some contaminants settle at the bottom, Boston, forming long-term radioactive filter, but the majority are carried out with the water into the ocean, which most likely caused the rapid growth of crustaceans. Mass fusion's activities were covered up by the mayor of Boston and other organizations, such as Galaxy News and the Boston Port Authority. Recall that it was the mayor, supported by General Atomics, who approved the tournament. Given the warnings sent to him, he could not have been unaware of the radiation in the water. The chief city attorney, while expressing sympathy, attempted to erase the monitoring station data. Galaxy News, instead of warning the public, spoke of wonderful upcoming crab fishing season. The Port Authority ignored the scientists entirely. Some agencies did attempt to interfere with illegal dumping, but they were physically eliminated to prevent information leakage, and even the oceanologists blamed other companies until the very end. The existence of a second disposal site at Lake Wanapoid is explained by the sheer volume of waste the company needed to get rid of. Money was apparently spent on employee retreats instead of constructing a proper disposal facility, leading to multiple deaths and severe radioactive contamination of Boston's water. Speculating further, it can be said that crabs and lobsters likely did not mutate solely because of mass fusion, but rather due to the nuclear war itself within the Fallout universe. Mass fusion clearly owned no legitimate disposal sites and illegally dumped waste across various locations. It's entirely possible that the company is responsible for many other radioactive barrels, which you can find in forests, fields, and along rivers and lakes throughout the Commonwealth. That's all for today. I hope you enjoyed this video. Leave a like, subscribe to the channel, hit the bell icon and leave a comment. See you next time.